As the Ukraine war rolls into its third year with Russia, the United States Congress has finally, after a long period of debate back and forth, passed a bill, or at least the House has actually passed a bill to give $61 billion to Ukraine. Apparently, the Senate will take it up within the next day or two, and the president's expected to sign it. And then it's going to start a process that's going to be sending lots of new ammunition, weapons, and other kinds of assistance to Ukraine. The Ukraine leaders claim that it's going to make a big difference. And they're already starting to plan on offensives and all kinds of other things like that. And it's time to kind of take a look at what does this $61 billion actually mean? Where is this war going? And what chance does Ukraine actually have of turning things around on the battlefield? And the best person we can think of to do that is one of our favorite guests, Colonel Doug Macgregor, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, combat veteran, highly decorated warrior, and just a great analyst. Doug, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks.
I know you have some opinions about some of this stuff, but after the House finally passed its bill, after 6 months of wrangling, Johnson went on, and first of all, he explained what's at stake here and why this is so important. I want you to listen to what he says and tell me what you think on the backside.
I said these are not normal times. They're not. The world is destabilized, and it's a tinderbox. It's a dangerous time. Three of our primary adversaries, Russia and Iran and China, are working together, and they're being aggressors around the globe. And they're a global threat to our prosperity and our security. Their advance threatens the free world, and it demands American leadership. If we turn our backs right now, the consequences could be devastating.
So I have a hard time understanding how passing $61 billion for Ukraine in its war with Russia has all of these global impacts, and the whole system of the global dominance by the United States is at risk if he doesn't. What do you think when you hear stuff like that?
Well, keep in mind, he's also passing a bill that involves surveillance without a warrant. That's going to have profound implications as well for the American people, frankly. We know from experience that if you give people in this country and the government authority to conduct surveillance without a warrant, well, they do, and they abuse the power. So this is a multiple catastrophe opportunity for Johnson, who's demonstrated that he's very much part of the problem and not the solution. The sad part is that we got to keep in mind that Lindsey Graham pointed out to everyone that without Donald Trump's endorsement and help, this bill probably wouldn't have passed, because he said, well done, Johnson, you're doing a great job, and I support you, and I support this bill. It's a disaster. It does nothing for the United States. And of course, you're subjected to the usual mantra that Russia, China, Iran. I'm surprised he didn't throw in North Korea. Probably forgot to mention that.
He probably forgot.
They're all locked shoulder to shoulder, and they're swimming across the Pacific or the Atlantic to reach our shores and take over. In the meantime, the borders are open, millions are pouring in, criminality's on the rise, and nothing's being done about it.
And so I guess when you hear them say stuff like that, it basically, the position they're making is that the existence of other countries is itself a threat to the United States. And the only thing we can do to save ourselves is to militarize up. And I think that history has shown that doesn't work out that way. And if you go down that path, it ends up costing your security, not improving it.
Well, we're going to militarize everything except our border, which desperately needs federal troops on it. And we need to bring a substantial portion of the surface fleet back to the United States, to coastal waters, and deal with not only open borders, but open ports. The Coast Guard is underarmed for what it's got to do, but the Coast Guard's busy sailing around in the South China Sea and the Persian Gulf. Our priorities are absolutely out of alignment with reality. But then again, so is Mr. Johnson.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you this, because in a minute, I'm going to talk about what else Johnson said after the passing of this bill, which is problematic of its own right. But let's look at that issue for a second, because that's one thing I really don't understand that I hope you can shed some light on. So the number one issue facing voters today of both parties, just Americans across the board, is the border by a big margin, way over economy, which has never happened before, not to this degree. And especially heading into an election year, it's ordinary that politicians and candidates would flock to whatever the public says that they want to. How is it then that this hugely bipartisan bill, which everyone touts in both the Senate and now the House, includes everything but border security? How does that work?
Well, it's very simple. The Americans whom they are supposed to represent simply cannot compete financially with the billionaire oligarchs who are effectively buying up Congress, the Senate, the House, and the White House. It's that simple. These are all bought men. Everyone is living today in Washington on what I would call Epstein Island writ large, and they come and go basically on the basis of how much money they're willing to take from their donors. And the donors are the people that control the island. You're either on the island or off the island. And I think Donald Trump is being told, if you want to be on the island and be president, you play along with what we, the oligarchs who control the money, want you to do. So he supported a bill which essentially jettisons his principles overboard and then throws, his supporters under the bus. It's that simple. We just can't compete. We don't have enough money to buy Johnson and his colleagues. Now, there were 21 stalwarts in the House of Representatives, people like Chip Roy and Andy Biggs and others that deserve credit for having stood their ground, including this one lady who is actually originally from Ukraine, is an Orthodox Christian.
Yeah.
And has Spots, I think is her name, or Spots, and she has said, absolutely don't vote for this, because she's concerned, as we should all be, frankly, with the welfare and the survival of the Ukrainian people, which doesn't seem to enter into the discussion at all.
Right.
Now, look, Dan, this is just another demonstration of the extent to which we are now the serfs on the plantation. We're supposed to obediently take orders and execute our tasks. We're supposed to part with whatever money, meager salaries we get, send it to Washington, and let them decide what's in our interests. And of course, that means they have no interest in us whatsoever. They're interested in the people that are in a position to make them rich.
Well, it's funny you put it that way,
on.
because and almost right on cue, here was Johnson also talking about the implications of this bill, not how it's going to change the terms of the war, not how it's going to make the world safe for democracy. It's going to make the world good for the military-industrial complex. Roll this tape.
Now, remember that 80% of the Ukraine funding will go to the replenishment of American weapons and stocks and our facilities and our operations. I've said it very simply. I'll say it once again. It's an old military adage, but we would rather send bullets to the conflict overseas than our own boys, our troops.
Like, I don't remember a military adage saying send bullets instead of our boys. I think that's kind of weird, but his bigger issue is he's actually celebrating that 80% of the money won't go to Ukraine.
Well, first of all, there's that expression of cowardice. We're not willing to fight, so we're going to send someone else in our place to do the fighting for us. Obviously, I don't think there's any requirement to fight the Russians under any circumstances.
Yeah, at all.
It's utterly stupid. But having said that, I would be ashamed as an American citizen, particularly one who holds public office, to state categorically that, well, we'll send bullets and weapons overseas, but not our men. We don't want to lose anybody in this. Well, if you don't want to lose anybody, if you don't have any skin in the game, why are you doing it to begin with? Well, we know the answer to that. This whole thing is a giant scam. He hasn't gotten any skin in the game other than he too wants to receive, his stipendium for doing what he's done. So that's the first part. I just, it's so deeply disturbing. It's hard to keep up with it. As far as the so-called military-industrial complex is concerned, the problem that Americans don't understand is that, yes, we do need to replenish the stocks. We have been very stupid. In fact, someone today called me and said, why don't we send Zelensky a telephone number for the government in Kabul, and perhaps he can cut a deal with the Taliban to buy secondhand all of the equipment we left behind in Afghanistan when we pulled out. I mean, the billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars invested in these enterprises is lost. There is no salvage value in any of this. We're just taking losses day in and day out. And how do we compensate for the losses? Well, we print money. We push the button and create more dollars. And with each time we do it, we're in an inflationary spiral that we can't control, a spending spiral that we can't control. Franklin Roosevelt was in such a spiral by 1939. He'd been spending heavily. And as Morgenthau, his Treasury Secretary, in testimony said at the time, it hasn't changed anything. It hasn't improved anything. He turned to the war machine, in other words, actual war, to reinvigorate the economy, restore it to some measure of health. Of course, he died before the war was over, and we could see the handiwork in the light of day. But the bottom line is, we don't want to go to war, because war today would be fatal for us. It would destroy everything. So what are we doing? The question is, what are we doing? And I think the answer is self-enrichment in Washington and concealing the truth from the American public, and hoping that no one in the American public will actually pull the curtain back and see what's happening.
Well, in fact, here's another another person that's playing that same game right here. I mean, one was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Here's the Secretary of Defense of the United States of America.
The replacements are designed and built in our industry, and so that means good jobs, jobs for people in America. So if that supplemental was passed, and when it gets passed, some $50 billion or so would flow through some 30 states here in America, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, that's what's really important. You get that $50 billion going to the Congress, the people who are supporting the congressmen. That's apparently where the
well, Dan, you know that national defense has been an exercise at income redistribution for a very long time. It's just reached an all-time low. No question about it. Yeah, this is a very famous picture, and everybody is smiling because everybody's got their hand out, and they're all making money, but the American people aren't profiting. Where's the return on investment in this stuff? In other words, when we build machinery and ship it overseas, whether it's agricultural machinery or any other sort of productive machinery, there's a return on the investment. In other words, you create a supply chain, you are meeting a demand, everybody benefits. We benefit, the people overseas to whom we export benefit. Where's the benefit to all of this military industrial investment? I don't see it. And that's why we look back on the past. We heard Donald Trump just a few days ago repeat his mantra from 2016. How many trillions have we spent and what have we got for it? Well, he seems to have forgotten that completely, turned around and reenacted new legislation that's going to perpetuate the very thing that he said he was going to be elected to fight. It's depressing.
And sometimes, in addition to money being the driving motivator, and maybe this is going to still be, but Gerald Connolly had a very interesting take on it, because a lot of people, like I just did, were saying, hey, where's the border provisions? Why do you keep doing all this stuff internationally and calling it a national security bill with no national security for our country? And here's what he said.
Do we understand the choices in front of us? They're clear. Some say, well, we have to deal with our border first. The Ukrainian-Russian border is our border. It's the border between depraved autocracy and freedom-loving people seeking our democratic way of life. Do we have a stake in that outcome? Yes.
Do we have a stake in that outcome? What? That's what I have to respond to. Because what are you talking about? Some mythical, theoretical border over there and how it affects us over here, ignoring the one that really exists.
Well, obviously the man is delusional, but this is part of the demonization of anybody that the globalist neocon clique that governs us doesn't like. What are we living in? Are we living in an oligarchy? What happened to the Bill of Rights? Do we actually have them? All the people in the audience who want to be arrested and be held without bail by a court in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, New York City, New Orleans, Los Angeles, or San Francisco, please raise your hands. Forget it. Nobody wants to go to court in any of those cities. Nobody wants to go to jail in those cities because we know there is no law in those cities. This is the problem. He's living in a world that doesn't exist. He thinks he's defending something that you and I spent most of our lives defending. Well, that's no longer there. And the enemy against which we had organized and trained to fight no longer exists. It's been gone now for 30 years.
Yeah.
It's all nonsense, and it's one big scam. How do you get the average American to understand it? Because the average American still listens to mainstream media. Well, that's what they said on TV.
Yeah, and if there's at least a glimmer of hope that because what it's going to take to answer that question is it's going to take leadership. Somebody has to stand up and start telling the truth and then acting on it. And I know a lot of people don't like him. He's got a kind of a controversial figure. He's got a lot of people like and dislike him. But Viktor Orban of Hungary doesn't seem to be afraid of what anybody seems to think. And he made some comments here in the last couple of days about how he views things in his own country and how he views the border here. Here's what he said, the first one.
I think that nations has the right to decide about their own future. So if somebody would like to make an attempt to create a mixed society, Christian-based with Muslim communities, and as liberals think the outcome will be something good, let's do it. It's your fate, it's your future, but don't force us to do so. So that's what we call the offer of tolerance, what I have made several times to Brussels. I said, guys, you can create whatever migration system you would like to do, but don't force Hungary to do the same thing, because we simply don't believe. We think that mixture of the two civilizations will be not resulted in good things.
And then on the issue of the Russia-Ukraine war, he added this.
We respect the rights of Ukraine, sovereignty of Ukraine, and people to create their own and maintain their own state. So therefore, invasion of Putin against Ukraine is totally against the values of international relations and all the values we all respect. So no question of that. But the Hungarian point of interest is that something must be between Russia and Hungary. So this is the number one. So we support Ukraine to survive somehow, which is questioned because Ukraine is not more sovereign state. Ukraine is now just protectorate of the West. So without getting the money and the weapons from the European Union and United States, Ukraine as a state would cease to exist. So it's not a sovereign state anymore.
So he's just calling it out like it is. He said, this is how I see it, which goes against everything, which is why he's hated by so many in the West, because he says what they are unwilling to, but what really exists, that Ukraine is nothing but a plaything for the United States, which is kind of what you said a second ago.
I think that you've got to go all the way back to Vietnam and remember that in the run-up to the Vietnam War, at one point, I don't know if it was President Eisenhower or President Kennedy, but the national security state told them that it was a vital strategic interest of the United States to ensure that Laos, this small landlocked Southeast Asian country, did not become a communist satellite. And from there, it spread then subsequently into Vietnam. It was not simply important that Vietnam be a bulwark against communism externally. It also had to be transformed internally into some sort of pristine democracy. We've seen this played out several times in the history of the United States since the end of World War II. In every instance, Dan, it has been an abysmal failure. Orban knows that. He knows that we are the ultimate social engineers. We're never satisfied to simply do business with another sovereign power on the basis of mutual respect and mutual interest. We want more. We want to be able to meddle, to reshape, to reorganize, to reform the way other people govern themselves, to alter or change their culture to suit us. In the process of doing these things, we create more enemies, more instability, and more tragedy around the world. It really needs to stop. You and I know what has happened in Iraq over the last 30 years. The initial approach, which was, we've really got to see a change in this regime with this man, Saddam Hussein, because he represents a danger primarily to Israel, but ultimately to the region. People said, all right, fine, let's remove Saddam Hussein. That was never enough, Dan. We had to march in and we had to engage in this massive societal engineering project, which of course has fallen apart cataclysmically. So this is hopeless. We've become this dangerous crusader state that is careening like a drunken man in any particular direction it wants to, and then expects everyone to worship us.
Yeah,
They don't. The world has had it with us.
That's self-evident. And one of the ironies, and you and I have talked about this several times on previous shows, that there could be reason, and actually you kind of touched on it again here. We could, if we were saying we're going to try to make negotiations and deals where people can mutually benefit from around the world, and we can just engage with the world as it is and benefit from it. Others can benefit from it. There doesn't have to be conflict. But now here's one of the big problems is, and one of our colleagues recently emailed you and I and was talking about some of the challenges to even seeking a negotiated settlement at this point with Ukraine and Russia, which we advocate for, but it's now much harder than it would have been because there's no trust in what our side is standing for. And now Putin may not settle for anything. Well, toward that end, here's something he said just a few days back about how he views dealing with the United States.
Сейчас тоже Ширака нет, Жака Ширака. Он был крупным таким политическим деятелем. Я как-то его спросил, почему американское руководство так себя ведет? Так агрессивно и так недальновидно действует в некоторых случаях. Он мне по-русски ответил, потому что некультурные.
I mean, he's like mocking us, that we not somebody that he can deal with. And so how is he going to make some kind of a deal on top of the fact that you had the Western leaders admit last year that the Minsk Accords that we had negotiated were never genuinely intended to be followed. And we've gotten out of, all these other treaties that we had with them. It's going to be hard for us to even get to a negotiated settlement without some major changes in how we relate to the world.
Well, no one has articulated this problem better than Chas Freeman. Ambassador Chas Freeman has said repeatedly that we have the unfortunate habit every 4 to 8 years of lobotomizing the government. We bring in a new president with a new administration, even though the new administration usually consists of retreads from some previous political administration, and they want to remake the world in some new fashion. They think the world is their playground. It stems from this sense of limitless resources, limitless money, and limitless power. This is why people like Kennedy in his book, The Decline, or what was it called? The Decline and Fall of Great Nations or something. I can't remember the exact title. Talked about the similarity between Spain, which was probably one of the richest countries in the history of mankind as a result of its acquisition of gold overseas in Latin America. How could it go from being the richest to one of the poorest and most backward? Well, the same problem, the sense of no limitations. Whatever happens in the world cannot happen without us. Well, that's wrong. We are not the center of the universe, nor did we ever want to be the center of the universe. In fact, we did initially hope that we would be left alone and could avoid entanglement in Europe's wars and wars elsewhere in Asia. We wanted to trade with everyone on the basis of mutual respect. We assumed that if we did that, we would be prosperous and peaceful. And that was our aim. We've completely lost sight of it because the apparatus in Washington has been hijacked. It's hijacked not just by ideologues, but by people with a lot of money who have driven policies in directions that they wanted to go. Some of these were designed to enhance them, but many of them were really ideologically driven. If you look carefully at the neocon way of thinking, the entire world will not be safe until the United States Army occupies virtually all of it. This is the sort of insanity that we've been dealing with now, certainly since the early 90s. And we've seen it over and over and over again, and it fails and it fails and it fails. Somalia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, move forward into Iraq, from Iraq, then into Syria, Libya, everywhere else you can imagine. It's depressing, but the American people have to put an end to it. And one of our colleagues, Mike Vlahos, was talking about the folly of proxy wars, particularly when you try to use a proxy war to achieve these seemingly unattainable aims. And France decided to back us because France was at war with Great Britain. And of course, the Spaniards backed the French in this enterprise, hoping that this war in the United States, this revolutionary war that we began, was going to sap Britain's resources and harm it. Well, the British were smarter than the French. The British cut their losses and got out when they realized it wasn't worth the squeeze. We managed to get out scot-free and in very good shape. The French, however, went deeply into debt because they kept investing and investing and investing when they probably should have bailed out earlier and let our war drag on a little longer, because we would have won it anyway. I think we have the same problem right now. We have invested too heavily in too many places for too long. They're all failures. We have no sense of loss. We simply walk past the latest disaster. We whistle past the graveyard, congratulate ourselves. It's very reminiscent of Bundy and McNamara, who had a letter exchange in which I think Bundy said to McNamara, we probably won't win in Vietnam, but it's still the right thing to do. This is 1965. The notion that you should do something when you are not convinced that you can win is absolutely unconscionable. It's beyond belief. And
yeah, I mean, you say the right thing to do, but it's immoral thing to do, because how many people paid with their lives on both sides of the conflict because of those kinds of actions? It's insane.
Yeah.
And it's funny you mentioned that back in the day that Britain was willing to say, hey, this is not working, let's cut our losses and move on, because the current British government isn't quite that same. And I'm about to play you a clip of what Rishi Sunak said earlier today. And then I actually recorded a view from the ground in London from Ian Puddock, one of our guests and one of our big followers here that we have, where he has some interesting comments. And I'll get your view on the backside of this. Roll that tape.
Today we go further. We will send Ukraine an additional £500 million, hitting £3 billion of support this year, and will provide them with the largest ever package of UK military equipment. This will include more than 400 vehicles, 4 million rounds of ammunition, 60 boats and offshore raiding craft, vital air defences, and long-range, precision-guided Storm Shadow missiles. And as we make our historic commitment to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, we'll move past this stop-start, piecemeal way of backing Ukraine, so that alongside our long-term security guarantee, we are today providing a long-term funding guarantee of at least the current level of military support to Ukraine for every year it is needed.
So to help kind of get the opinion on the ground of what people in London are thinking about what the Prime Minister just said, we go to the smartest man in London, Ian Puddock, one of our favorites on the show, and somebody who's got his ear to the ground on London and really knows a lot about what's going on there. So Ian, I just wonder, you just watched that clip there from the Prime Minister. What do you think when he says, first of all, that in addition to security guarantees for Ukraine, he's now talking an open-ended, however many years it takes, all that long list of stuff he mentioned, apparently is going to continue going on to Ukraine. What do people on the ground in London think about that?
It depends how engaged the person is, but I would say, so if you look at the vast majority of mums and dads and just normal working people that just go to work, have a job, look after their families and live a normal life, they are subjected to the narrative that the mainstream media, whether it be on TV or written press, give them. And that is Putin woke up one morning, decided to invade a peaceful neighbor and killed loads of innocent people. Who would not be against that? Who would not be? What person in their right mind would not be against that? It's a rhetorical statement in as much. But the reality is most people do live in that bubble. And there are obviously a smaller group of people that are online, that are engaged, that are able to look at the full context of what's going on. But, Sunak's made this huge statement. We're not 5 minutes into this war. The war's been going on for, a couple of years, and he's just made this big renewed effort about how we're going to give them this amount of money and all of these weapons. Well, I know for a fact, And I messaged my friends at the MOD earlier when we spoke, when you said, can you come on? I said, right, where's the magic wand? Now, I know that the two big military, UK military munitions storage facilities, one in Telford and one in Bicester, are depleted. Now, they were depleted last year. It's not like they were just in the last few weeks we've run down. They were depleted last year. And it's a mess. It's an absolute mess. So the secret to Sunak's magic wand is we're going to give them all this money. We're going to give them all these munitions. That's fantastic. Well, nobody's been able to do that. I tweeted just the other day that going through Germany and Poland, where all of the weapons get into Ukraine, they're 30% down. Sorry, forgive me. They're more than 30% down. So it could be 50%. It could be 60%. I genuinely have no idea. I know it's more than 30%. So, all this wonderful, we're going to rally and help our friends and give them all of this stuff. The $1 million question is when.
Yeah. And so, I mean, we're talking, he said 400 military vehicles, millions of rounds of ammunition, and Storm Shadow missiles too. You guys don't have that many of them. So the question is, do you have enough to keep giving them year after year, like you said?
Yeah, we do. The Storm Shadows, we do, and they have a good arsenal, not only here in the UK but in Ukraine, of Storm Shadows. But with the Storm Shadows, obviously they need to be configured by British soldiers. They're not just off the shelf products, and obviously those British, what we call NATO trainers, British soldiers that are based in Ukraine, are far from they're not in the trenches. They're not on the front line doing all of the fighting. They are in the background safely. But it's just a complete mess. It's a complete mess. And we're digging, as Professor Mearsheimer said, all we're doing is digging ourselves in further and further and further. And where's the off-ramp? Because nobody dares say, look, Colonel Daniels, can we just stand? I don't like you. You don't like me. We don't get on. But hang on, can we just stop and talk? I mean, it's just not even up for debate. It's just insane.
And that's really kind of what you had said a second ago, is that we don't willing to talk to anyone. We just want to compel our vision on the world, even when it's contradictory to observed reality. And at some point, Doug, that's just got to have a crash in it, doesn't it?
Well, the crash is coming. And sadly for your friend Ian, we can go back to 1914 when Britain arguably had the highest standard of living in Europe, where every British house was receiving fresh milk every morning. And I mean, I could go down the list. People were eating well, living well, and all of that was unnecessarily put at risk by Britain's entry into the First World War. And I would argue that Britain has been on the downslide ever since. It's destroyed itself in a series of wars that it didn't need to fight. And that's effectively what we've done. We've wasted and squandered our wealth on things that are irrelevant to us, on the grounds that something happening somewhere else does make a difference, when in reality, it doesn't. And by meddling in it, we can actually make it worse. So I feel very sorry for the British, because Britain is now an imitation great power. 72,000 men in the British Army. I don't think it's been that small, really, since after the Napoleonic Wars. And it was never very large to begin with, but this is ridiculous. And to suggest, as some people have, that the British and the French, as part of a NATO force, would go into Ukraine when the French army is roughly 120,000, all you have to do is just add up all the numbers, and it's pitiful. It doesn't even make up a quarter of the force that the Russians can put in the field. And of course, it's a polyglot. It's not integrated into any sort of fighting force, doesn't have unity of command, can't even speak the same language. The whole thing is a catastrophe. By the way, we're not much better off. This facade needs to be dropped. But no one wants to admit the key thing. Look, we made a mistake. We grossly underestimated Russia. We told you this was vital. It's not. We need a new course of action. The new course of action is we end the war as soon as possible. We retrench. We cut unnecessary spending. None of that's being discussed. None of it will be discussed. I think we collectively in the West, with the United States in the lead, are all going to go over the proverbial cliff. In fact, some people argue we're already going over it and we don't realize.
We just haven't hit the other side. And kind of to help propel us that instead of listening to what you just said, instead of listening to what Mearsheimer, who was on earlier today on our show, said the same thing about what we should do, almost verbatim what you said. Instead, we're listening to this guy.
The support from the United States of America, and of course it's the support of the American people, because the political decisions depend on the public opinion, and this aid will strengthen Ukraine and send the Kremlin a powerful signal that it will not be the second Afghanistan.
He will send a powerful signal to Putin that we're not going to be another Afghanistan when we're already screaming down the road of another Afghanistan. It's just insane.
Well, we have to understand this man is not serious. He's an actor who was picked to play a role in this giant theatrical production that's run out of Washington, London, Paris, and Brussels by oligarchs. Once again, people with hundreds of millions, billions of dollars who decided that he was a useful tool that could allow us to do things that we thought were in our interests. Well, we were wrong. We've lost everything. He's finished. He'll be gone in a month. And then the world will wonder where he went. I mean, assuming he gets out of Ukraine alive, I suppose he'll end up somewhere south of St. Petersburg in Florida, or perhaps in the suburbs of LA, who knows, or he can join the Afghan crowd that came out with lots of money that have 23-room mansions in Maryland. Look, this whole thing is so depressing that it's hard to keep a straight face and talk about it without throwing up.
Yes, and I'm sorry, I don't want to push you over the edge on that, but I do got one more to show you, because it's just hard to, even with all of this and with all the things that we've seen over the last 2+ years, this one is a little odd. So this is Zelensky again, who kind of has, well, something like a Messiah complex.
How long should Americans be expected to fund the war in Ukraine?
The Americans are not funding the war in Ukraine. They first and foremost protect freedom and democracy all over Europe. And Ukraine is fighting, and Ukraine is sending its best sons and daughters to the front line, and it reduces the price for all Europe, for all NATO. It reduces the price for everyone, including the US.
So he's going to save us all, Doug. He's going to save Europe, the United States. He's doing it for all of us. He's like this. He's the Messiah. He's going to be the big savior. And one wonders, you said he was an actor hired. One wonders to what point does they cross over from acting to actually believing what they're saying? I don't know.
That's a difficult question to answer. Obviously, he's drunk a lot of his own Kool-Aid for a long time and may be delusional enough at this point to believe some of what he says. There's not much difference between him and Congressman Connolly. You began with Connolly.
Yeah.
He's making the same argument. Thomas Jefferson used to say, until all men are free, none of us are free. Well, Washington and Hamilton said that's categorically wrong. We are absolutely free. And we're not putting our freedom at risk in a war to support the French Revolution, which Jefferson wanted to support, that is killing all of its elites, destroying its society, its institutions, and ultimately embroil the world in wars for decades. And of course, they were right. They hadn't seen Napoleon yet, but that's ultimately what happened. This kind of universality has no place on planet Earth. We have to live where we live. We need to take care of ourselves and the people that we live with first. We need to wish others well. But unless they are actively threatening us, there's no reason to bother them. And the truth is that, China, Russia, Iran, again, North Korea, whatever you like or don't like about them shrinks to insignificance next to what's happening here at home. Because if we suddenly packed our bags and left and came back here to deal with the really serious problems that are threatening the existence of our country, it would be a long time before anybody noticed. And something else that's important to understand, We're not the only power in the world. We never were, nor will we ever be. And in our absence in any of these regions of the world, other actors will emerge. They will turn their attention to their own problems in their region. And when I talk about this, people look at me and they don't understand that we're newcomers. You know, these regions of the world, whether it's the Middle East or Asia or Europe or Central Asia or Africa, they've been there for thousands of years. They will be there long after we're gone. We need to come to terms with that and understand that what we should focus on is our survival, our prosperity, our stability, our peace. And if we don't, we continue on this road, everything could be lost.
And what hopes do we have, Doug? I mean, I know that you've started Our Country, Our Choice, and I know you're building up an alternative or at least another path for somebody to try to do something. But I wonder if you could actually just tell us a little bit about what hope does your organization offer? Because without something being different, the current status of mind, whether it's Republican, Democrat, they all seem to be kind of conglomerated into one right now, and the people don't seem to be getting a voice.
Well, as we see more and more evidence for exactly what you just described, that the candidates as a group are disappointing and compromised universally, we see no alternative to the foundation of a third party. And in many respects, we think we can provide the backbone for that. But you're not going to get those things until three things occur. Number one, you've got to have the real crisis here at home. People have to reach the point where they can't afford to buy food. They can't afford to buy fuel. They can't get to work, or they don't have any jobs, where law really breaks down and the economy collapses. Unfortunately, those are the kinds of things that necessarily obtain in order for really fundamental change to occur to right the ship. And our ship is listing badly to one side. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing is that people have to discover the truth of what you're saying on their own. You can tell somebody the truth and it won't penetrate. They have to convince themselves of the truth. And that is that people have to finally recognize, you know, what's happening in Washington isn't working. The people there really aren't interested in us. They're not representing our interests. We can tell them that that's the case, but they've got to convince themselves. When those first two things happen, then you get the third thing, which is a new direction in the form of a new political movement, a new party. And we're not there yet. We have to get the first two conditions, and those first two conditions haven't been met.
And that is so, I mean, it's hopeful on the one hand, but really discouraging on the other hand, that enough of the facts and the evidence are so very evident right now across the board. You can talk about almost anything, and then governance, law and order, foreign policy, domestic policy. The trend lines are clear and the actions are clear, if only people would be willing to see it. And there are courses of action. There are things that could be done differently right now. But I can't argue with what you just said, that until some kind of crash or collapse happens, people aren't going to be willing to buck the system that's been in evidence for the last century plus.
Well, Dan, keep something else in mind. You and I have plenty of experience with the military and seeing soldiers in the field, not just soldiers, also airmen, sailors, Marines. They're very resilient people. The Americans are. And I have great confidence that when these things develop, that Americans that believe in themselves, believe in their country, will come forward. I have no doubt at all. And we will see fundamental change. We will see new faces, because they will realize that the majority of the people they're dealing with right now are not going to get the job done. They cannot divest themselves of the past. They cannot march into the future because they're part of the past. But we're not there yet, but we will get there. And yes, it will be traumatic. It's going to be tough, but we will come through it.
Well, I do have that confidence that there are still, for all the things that we point out in the clips that we show here about just a lot of nonsense that a lot of people are saying now, there are still a great many amazing people in this country, men and women of all different backgrounds. I mean, we saw them when we were serving. There's just great Americans from every quarter, but they're being held down by a system that's really oppressing really any kind of possibility of going into the future. So we do have that to look forward to. I guess it's just unfortunate that it's going to cause or cost something really bad happening before that gets there. But That's the world we live in, and we have to deal with what we have, right?
That's right. Yeah. No one's going to get off this train until the locomotive stops.
That's well said, Doug. Well, listen, thanks ever so much. And by the way, if there's if people want to learn any more about your organization, or if they want to get on board with somebody who's looking toward the future, where can they go?
OurCountryOurChoice.com. Or just go to the website, see what you see, and evaluate it. We're all about faith, family, and country, first and foremost. And I think those things will get us through the trauma to come. And I think they'll find that these distinctions of Republican and Democrat don't mean a great deal anymore. It all boils down to, are you an American? Do you believe in your country? Do you love it? If you do, I think you'll be happy to join us.
Well, I certainly am, and that's why I'm eager to participate with what you guys are doing and support it wherever we can, because I think that is really the only viable pathway I see right now for the country to improve, especially if some kind of a crash does come. And we'll continue to watch that and look forward to having you on our next show.
Okay, thanks, Dan.
And thank you so much for coming on as well. We always value you guys a lot. Be sure and hit the like and subscribe button. And by all means, folks, share this video with others that you see. And I'm talking about go tag people on mainstream media, some of the other, in X or any of the other kinds of social media that you're part of. Tag people with this video. Show them what's out there, that there is some alternatives. There are some people who are talking sane and that understand the reality and have a path to avoid some of these worst outcomes. We're all in this together, folks. You and us, everybody together. We do want to have a better future. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you. Actually, tomorrow we have Jacques Beau back again. Always another great guy that everybody loves to hear, because he truly does have a good understanding of what's going on, especially from a European perspective. We'll see you tomorrow on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.